On the clinic's opening day, Grace and Jonathan fight to save their reputations from Victoria Sterling's devastating scheme. But as Victoria's final attack unearths a secret Grace has kept buried, their love, the clinic, and everything they've built hangs by a thread. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The massive windows of Cross Industries' penthouse office revealed the glittering New York City skyline, but Jonathan Cross barely noticed it anymore. At 40 years old, he had everything money could buy, but tonight, like most nights, he sat, alone at his desk, reviewing another company he planned to acquire. "Mr. Cross," his assistant Barbara called through the intercom, "don't forget about the charity gala tonight." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. These events were all the same: fake smiles, hollow conversations, and people wanting something from him. But as New York's most eligible billionaire, he had to keep up appearances. "Send." "My driver around," he replied, closing his laptop. In his private bathroom, Jonathan straightened his black tie and studied his reflection. His dark suit cost more than what most people made in a month, but his blue eyes looked tired, empty. When was the last time he'd genuinely smiled? He couldn't remember. The charity gala was exactly what he expected. Women in designer dresses flirted with him while their husbands tried to pitch business deals. Jonathan played his part, charming, polite, but distant. He signed a check for $1 million, posed for photos, and counted the minutes until he could leave. "Jonathan, darling." Miranda Peterson, a divorced socialite, grabbed his arm. "You simply must meet my daughter. She just finished her MBA at Harvard." "Maybe another time," Jonathan said, gently pulling away. He'd been through this routine countless times. The endless parade of eligible young women from good families, all hoping to catch New York's most valuable bachelor. Rain had started falling when Jonathan finally escaped the gala. His driver, Thomas, held an umbrella as they walked to the car. That's when Jonathan saw her. A black woman sat under a dim streetlight holding a cardboard sign. Unlike most homeless people he passed daily, she sat with her back straight, head held high. Her clothes were worn but clean, and there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination that caught his attention. Jonathan reached for his wallet, ready to hand her a $100 bill, but the words on her sign made him stop. "We'll work for food. Hope is free." "Wait here," he told Thomas, walking toward the woman. "Here," Jonathan said, holding out the money. To his surprise, she didn't take it. "Can you read?" she asked, pointing to her sign. "I said work for food, not handouts." Jonathan stared at her, taken aback. In his world, nobody refused money, especially not from him. "You're sitting in the rain and you're turning down $100? My dignity isn't for sale," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But if you want to offer me work, I'm listening." Rain dripped from Jonathan's expensive suit, but for the first time in years, something had captured his full attention. "What's your name?" "Grace Porter." "Well, Grace Porter, how about this? There's a diner around the corner. I'll buy you dinner, and in exchange you can tell me your story. That's work. You'll be providing a service." Grace studied him for a long moment. "Why would a man in a $3,000 suit want to hear my story?" "Because you're the first person in years who's turned down my money," Jonathan answered honestly. A small smile tugged at Grace's lips. "That suit costs more than $3,000, Mr. Cross." "Jonathan Cross." "The Jonathan Cross?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "The one they call the Wall Street Wolf." "You follow business news?" I read. "When you can't afford a TV or phone, newspapers." "In the library become your entertainment." Grace stood up, gathering her few belongings. "All right, Mr. Cross, you've got yourself a deal, but I warn you, my story isn't pretty." Jonathan signaled to Thomas, who looked shocked at the sight of his boss talking to a homeless woman. "The diner on 52nd Street, Jonathan instructed, "and bring the car around in an hour." The diner was nearly empty. The late-night waitress did a double take when Jonathan Cross walked in with Grace, but she said nothing. They settled into a quiet booth at the back. "Order whatever you want," Jonathan said. Grace picked up the menu, her movements careful and deliberate. A cheeseburger, fries, and coffee. Black. After the waitress left, Grace folded her hands on the table. Close up, Jonathan could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s. Despite her circumstances, her dark skin glowed with health, and her eyes were clear and intelligent. "So, Mr. Cross, what kind of story are you expecting? Something to make you feel good about helping the poor? Or something to shock your rich friends at their next charity gala?" "I want the truth," Jonathan replied, "and drop the Mr. Cross. It's Jonathan." Grace's coffee arrived, and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "The truth is simple. I was a nurse at Mercy Hospital, had an apartment, a car, a normal life. Then my mother got sick, aggressive cancer. The insurance didn't cover all the treatments, so I took out loans. Worked double shifts, sold everything I could." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Mom died anyway. A month later I got injured at work, slipped disc in my back. Couldn't work for 3 months. The bills piled up, the loans went into default. And here I am." "There are programs, shelters," Jonathan started. "All full," Grace cut him off. "Or not safe for a woman alone. I've kept my nursing license active, used the computers at the library to do online courses. I'm not looking for pity, Jonathan. I'm looking for work." Their food arrived. Grace ate slowly with the same dignity she'd shown on the street. Jonathan watched her, fascinated. In his world of corporate takeovers and million-dollar deals, he'd forgotten people like this existed. People with nothing who still maintained their pride. "I could help you," he said finally. "I know people. One phone call, I could get you a job, an apartment." "No." Grace's voice was firm. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want charity. It's not charity if you work for it. It is when it comes from pity." Grace wiped her mouth with a napkin. "Thank you for dinner. I've fulfilled my end of the deal. You got your story." She stood up, gathering her worn backpack. "You're an interesting man, Jonathan Cross. Different than what the newspapers say, but do yourself a favor. Don't try to save me. I'll save myself." Jonathan watched her walk out of the diner, her head held high despite her circumstances. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, a mix of admiration, frustration, and curiosity. "Thomas," he called his driver. "From now on, I want to know if that woman returns to that street corner, and I want to know everything about Grace Porter, where she spends her days, what she needs." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, but Jonathan barely heard him. His mind was already racing with plans, but something told him that Grace Porter wouldn't make any of them easy. That night, in his luxury penthouse apartment, Jonathan couldn't sleep. The image of Grace's proud face kept appearing in his mind. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, she had turned down his help. It was refreshing and incredibly frustrating. Little did he know, this rainy evening was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, Jonathan couldn't focus on work. His secretary, Barbara, noticed something was different when he asked her to cancel his lunch meeting with potential investors, something he'd never done before. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Cross?" Barbara asked, concerned. In 15 years, working for him, she'd never seen him so distracted. "I'm fine," Jonathan replied, staring out his office window. "Barbara, what do you know about the homeless situation in our city?" Barbara blinked in surprise. "Not much, sir, though I do volunteer at the St. Mary's Soup Kitchen once a month." "St. Mary's?" Jonathan turned around. "Where is that?" "Just 10 blocks from here." Why the sudden interest? Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his coat. "Cancel my afternoon meetings too." At St. Mary's, Jonathan found exactly who he was looking for. Grace Porter was serving food to a line of homeless people, wearing an apron over her worn clothes. She looked up when he walked in, but didn't stop what she was doing. "Following me now, Mr. Cross?" she asked when he approached. "My driver said you come here often." "Having me watched?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's not creepy at all." "I want to help, and I already told you I don't want your help." Grace filled another bowl with soup. "If you're here, make yourself useful. Put on an apron and serve some food." To everyone's surprise, especially his own, Jonathan did exactly that. He rolled up his sleeves, put on an apron over his designer suit, and spent the next 2 hours serving food alongside Grace. "Your technique needs work," Grace commented, watching him struggle with the ladle. "But not bad for a billionaire." "I'm a fast learner." Jonathan handed a bowl to an elderly man. How often do you volunteer here? Every day I can. They let me eat here in exchange for help. Grace's voice softened. These people, they're not just statistics, Jonathan. Each one has a story. As they worked, Jonathan noticed how Grace knew everyone's names, their situations, their needs. She spoke to them with respect, listened to their problems, offered advice about free clinics and job opportunities. You're still a nurse, he realized, even without a hospital. Once a caregiver, always a caregiver. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. Though I miss real nursing, having the proper tools, being able to really help people. You could have that again, Jonathan said carefully. I know the board chairman at Mercy Hospital. One phone call, stop. Grace held up her hand. I told you I don't want your charity. Why are you so stubborn? Jonathan felt his frustration rising. You help all these people, but you won't let anyone help you. Because I've seen what happens when you rely on others. Grace's voice rose slightly. My mother trusted the insurance company. I trusted the hospital where I worked. Look where that got us. An older woman approached them, interrupting their argument. Grace, honey, my grandson's fever is back. Could you take a look? Grace's expression immediately softened. Of course, Mrs. Martinez. Let me wash my hands. Jonathan watched as Grace examined a young boy in a quiet corner. Her hands were gentle, her voice soothing as she spoke to him in basic Spanish. She took off her own scarf and wrapped it around the shivering child. He needs antibiotics, Grace told Mrs. Martinez. Take him to the free clinic on 4th Street. Ask for Dr. Rodriguez. Tell him Grace sent you. After they left, Jonathan spoke quietly. You gave away your only scarf. He needed it more than I do. Grace started cleaning up the serving station. Look, Jonathan, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you can't fix everything with money and phone calls. Then what can I do? Jonathan asked, surprising himself with how much he wanted an answer. Grace studied him for a moment. If you really want to help, come back tomorrow, not in a suit. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. Learn these people's names. Listen to their stories. Understand why some problems can't be solved with a checkbook. And if I do that, then maybe I'll start believing you see me as a person, not a charity case. Grace untied her apron. I have to go. There's a library computer reserved in my name. Need to complete my continuing education credits to keep my nursing license. Let me drive you, Jonathan offered. It's getting cold. I can walk. Grace gathered her backpack. But thanks for helping today. You surprised me. After she left, Jonathan stayed at St. Mary's talking to the volunteers. He learned that Grace had been coming there for months, that she often gave away her own food portions to others, that she provided basic medical care to those who couldn't afford a doctor. Back in his office that evening, Jonathan made some calls. Not to hospital boards or hiring managers, but to his real estate division. The empty building we own on 4th Street, he told his property manager. I want it renovated. Full update, heating, plumbing, everything, and I want it done fast. Are we selling it? The manager asked. No, Jonathan replied, looking at a news article about homeless statistics in New York. We're going to turn it into something else. That night, as Jonathan lay in his king-sized bed in his penthouse apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about Grace giving away her scarf. In his world, people only gave things expecting something in return. But Grace gave freely, even when she had almost nothing herself. His phone buzzed. Another socialite inviting him to a charity ball. Jonathan deleted the message without responding. For the first time in years, he had somewhere else he wanted to be tomorrow. Meanwhile, across the city in a small shelter, Grace wrapped herself in a thin blanket, thinking about the surprising sight of Jonathan Cross, serving soup to the homeless. She'd expected him to leave when she challenged him to help, but he'd stayed. Maybe there was more to the billionaire than she'd thought. But Grace had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. Rich men with good intentions had a way of disappearing when things got difficult. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself hoping he would actually come back tomorrow. The next morning, Jonathan Cross did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He dressed in jeans and a sweater. His driver, Thomas, nearly didn't recognize him. The soup kitchen again, sir? Thomas asked, trying to hide his concern. The board of directors wouldn't like seeing their CEO serving food to the homeless. Yes, Jonathan replied. And Thomas? If anyone from the office asks, I'm in meetings all day. Of course, sir. Thomas had worked for Jonathan long enough to know when his boss was up to something big. He just hoped this Grace Porter was worth all the trouble. Little did either of them know, trouble was exactly what was coming, but not from where they expected. Word spread quickly through New York's high society that Jonathan Cross, the city's most powerful CEO, had been spotted serving food at a homeless shelter. Victoria Sterling, Jonathan's ex-fiancée from 3 years ago, was the first to bring it up at the weekly charity committee meeting. It's absolutely bizarre, Victoria told the other socialites, stirring her martini. Someone saw him wearing jeans, and apparently he's been talking to some homeless woman. Across the table, Regina Cross, Jonathan's younger sister, felt her face flush with anger. As head of the Cross Family Foundation, she'd spent years protecting their families. Image, I need to talk some sense into my brother, Regina announced, pulling out her phone. This is getting out of hand. At the soup kitchen, Jonathan was too busy to worry about gossip. He'd been coming every day for 2 weeks now, learning the regulars' names and stories. Today, he was helping Grace organize donated medical supplies. You're getting better at this, Grace admitted, watching him sort medications by expiration date. Though your alphabetizing needs work. My secretary usually handles that, Jonathan joked. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, though Grace still kept her guard up. Their moment was interrupted by the click of expensive heels on the shelter's floor. Regina Cross walked in, looking completely out of place in her designer suit. Jonathan, Regina's voice was sharp. We need to talk privately. Grace stood up. I'll give you 2 a minute. No, stay, Jonathan said, surprising both women. Whatever Regina has to say, she can say in front of you. Regina's eyes narrowed as she looked at Grace. Fine. Jonathan, the board is concerned. You've missed 3 important meetings this week. There are rumors about you spending time in places like this. People are talking. Let them talk. Jonathan continued sorting supplies. This isn't a game, Regina snapped. The Sterling Group is threatening to pull out of our merger. Victoria says you're having some kind of breakdown. Victoria needs to mind her own business. Jonathan finally looked up. And so do you, Regina. I'm trying to protect you. Our family name means something in this city. Regina turned to Grace. I don't know what kind of scheme you're running, but that's enough. Jonathan's voice was quiet but firm. Grace has never asked me for anything. She's actually refused my help multiple times. Then what are you doing here? Regina demanded. Before Jonathan could answer, Mrs. Martinez rushed in with her grandson. The boy was worse, his fever higher than before. Grace! Mrs. Martinez called out, panic in her voice. He won't wake up properly. Grace immediately switched into nurse mode, running to check the boy. His fever's too high. He needs to go to the hospital. We can't, the bills. Mrs. Martinez started crying. I'll handle it, Jonathan said automatically. No, Grace's voice was firm. You'll teach her to depend on handouts. Mrs. Martinez, remember what we talked about. The medical assistance program, show them. The paperwork I helped you fill out. They have to treat him. Regina watched in shock as her powerful brother helped Grace carry the sick boy to her car. Grace's voice was calm as she explained to Mrs. Martinez exactly what to tell the hospital staff and what rights she had. I'm going with them, Grace told Jonathan. They'll try to turn her away if someone who knows the system isn't there. After they left, Regina stared at her brother. You've changed. Maybe I needed to. Jonathan started cleaning up the medical supplies. Grace is teaching me things all your charity balls never did. You're falling for her, Regina realized. Jonathan, think about what you're doing. She's what? Jonathan challenged. Homeless? Poor? She's also the most genuine person I've ever met. She helps people because it's right, not for tax write-offs or social media photos. The board won't accept this. The board works for me, not the other way around. Jonathan's voice left no room for argument. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to the hospital. At the hospital, Jonathan found Grace arguing with a dismissive administrator about patient rights. The administrator's attitude changed quickly when he recognized Jonathan. Mr. Cross, we had no idea you were involved. I'm not, Jonathan interrupted, but you should listen to Miss Porter. She knows what she's talking about. 3 hours later, Mrs. Martinez's grandson was receiving proper treatment. Grace sat in the waiting room, exhausted but satisfied. "Thank you," she said quietly to Jonathan, "for backing me up. You're the one who knew what to do." Jonathan handed her a coffee. "Grace, I've been thinking, that empty building I own on 4th Street, I want to turn it into a free clinic." Grace looked suspicious. "Jonathan, not for you, for them." He gestured to the waiting room full of people who couldn't afford care. "But I need someone who understands both medicine and the community, someone who won't let people fall through the cracks. And you want my opinion? I want more than that. I want you to run it." Grace nearly dropped her coffee. "What? Not as a favor, as a job. Real salary, real responsibilities. You'd have complete control over how it's run." "Why me?" "Because you're the only person I trust to do it right." Jonathan met her eyes. "Think about it. No strings attached." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I'll think about it, but I'm not making any promises." Back at his office that evening, Jonathan found Regina waiting for him. "I've been doing some research on your friend," Regina said, dropping a file on his desk. Grace Porter was a respected nurse. Perfect record. "But there's something else you should know about her past." Jonathan didn't open the file. "Whatever it is, Grace will tell me herself when she's ready." "You really care about her," Regina said softly. "More than I've cared about anyone in a long time," Regina sighed. "Then I hope you know what you're doing, because once the media finds out about her, things are going to get complicated." Later that night, Grace sat in the shelter, staring at a worn photo of her mother. "What would you think of all this, Mom?" she whispered. "A free clinic, it's everything we dreamed about." But as she thought about Jonathan's offer, Grace couldn't help but worry. Getting involved with someone like Jonathan Cross meant stepping into his world, a world that had already shown its teeth through Regina's visit. And Grace had secrets of her own, things from her past that she wasn't ready to share, things that could ruin everything if they came to light. Across town, Victoria Sterling picked up her phone. "Hello?" "Yes, I need information about someone." "A woman named Grace Porter, and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes." The pieces were being set for a storm that would test not just Jonathan and Grace's growing feelings, but everything they believed about trust, love, and redemption. Victoria. Sterling sat in her luxurious office, reviewing the private investigator's report on Grace Porter. A smile spread across her perfectly made-up face as she read. "Oh, this is better than I expected," she murmured, picking up her phone to call Regina Cross. "Regina, darling, we need to meet. There's something you should know about your brother's new friend." Meanwhile, renovations on the 4th Street building were moving quickly. Jonathan stood with Grace in what would soon be the clinic's main reception area, watching her examine the plans. "The layout is good," Grace said, tracing the blueprints with her finger. "But we need more exam rooms and a bigger waiting area. These people often bring their whole families. Consider. Get it done." Jonathan loved watching her like this, confident, passionate, in her element. "Does this mean you're accepting the job?" Grace hesitated. "I'm still thinking about it." "What's holding you back?" Before she could answer, Jonathan's phone buzzed. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said, frowning at the message. "Apparently it's urgent." "Go," Grace told him. "I need to get to the shelter anyway. They're expecting a big crowd tonight. Temperature's dropping." At Cross Industries, Jonathan found the boardroom tense. Victoria Sterling sat next to Regina, both women wearing identical smug expressions. "Jonathan," Victoria purred, "we're all concerned about this clinic project of yours." "The clinic isn't up for discussion," Jonathan said firmly. "It's my building, my money." "But it is our concern," said Richard Hampton, the eldest board member, "when you're planning to put someone with a criminal record in charge." Jonathan felt his stomach drop. "What?" Victoria slid a folder across the table. "Grace Porter was arrested 5 years ago, charged with drug theft from the hospital where she worked." "That's impossible," Jonathan said, but his hands shook as he opened the folder. "The charges were dropped," Regina added almost sympathetically, "but she resigned from the hospital immediately after. There were rumors about addiction, about selling medications." Stop!" Jonathan's voice was ice cold. "None of this is true. Grace is the most honest person I know. The arrest record is real, Victoria said. I have proof. Is this really who you want running your clinic? Think of the liability, the scandal. Jonathan stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. Meeting's over. Jonathan, Regina called after him, we're trying to protect you. But Jonathan was already gone, driving, through the darkening city toward the shelter. His mind raced. It couldn't be true. There had to be an explanation. He found Grace helping an elderly man with his medications. She looked up when Jonathan entered, her smile fading at his expression. We need to talk, he said quietly. In a back office of the shelter, Grace listened. As Jonathan explained what he'd learned, she didn't seem surprised, just tired. So they finally found it, she said softly. I wondered when this would come up. Is it true? Grace met his eyes. Yes and no, I was arrested. The charges were dropped because I was innocent. But the real story, it's complicated. Tell me. Jonathan's voice was gentle. Please. Grace took a deep breath. I was working night. Shift in the pharmacy. Started noticing discrepancies in the inventory. Powerful painkillers going missing. I reported it to my supervisor, but nothing changed. Then I discovered one of the doctors was falsifying prescriptions, selling medications on the side. She paused, her hands clasped tightly together. I gathered evidence, planned to report him to the medical board, but he found out. Next thing, I knew security cameras showed me accessing the pharmacy after hours. Records with my signature appeared, authorizing medication transfers that never happened. It was all forged, but it looked real. Why didn't you fight it? The doctor had connections, my word against his. I was just a nurse. Grace's voice cracked slightly. They offered me a deal, resigned quietly, charges dropped. I took it. A month later, my mother got sick and, well, you know the rest. Jonathan reached for her hand. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to see me, not my past. Grace pulled her hand away. And because I knew this would happen eventually. Your world doesn't forgive people like me, Jonathan. One mistake, one accusation, and you're done. I don't care what they think. You should. You have shareholders, responsibilities. Grace stood up. Maybe this clinic idea isn't so good after all. Grace, wait. But she was already walking away, leaving Jonathan alone with the weight of her story. Back at his office, Jonathan made some calls. By midnight he had a name, Dr. James Morrison, now practicing at a private clinic in Connecticut. The same doctor who had framed Grace. Victoria Sterling was still working late when Jonathan stormed into her office. I know what you did, he said coldly. Digging up Grace's past, trying to destroy her reputation. It ends now, Victoria smiled. Oh, Jonathan, you always did have a weakness for lost causes. First me, now her. You're nothing like her. Jonathan's voice was firm. Grace helps people, you just destroy them. I'm trying to help you. That woman is poison for your reputation. The media will tear her apart. Let them try. Jonathan turned to leave, then paused. By the way, Victoria, you're out of the merger deal. Find another company to save your failing business. Victoria's face went pale. You can't do that. I just did. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Grace, about everything she'd been through. His phone showed a dozen missed calls from Regina and the board members, but only one message mattered. From his private investigator, confirming Grace's story about Dr. Morrison. Across town, Grace sat in her usual spot at the shelter, helping a young mother fill out medical forms. Despite her own troubles, she couldn't stop helping others. It was who she was, Grace. She looked up to find Mrs. Martinez watching her. That rich man, he cares for you. It's not that simple, Mrs. Martinez. Love is never simple, mihija, but running away from it doesn't make it easier. Grace thought about Jonathan, how he'd listened to her story without judgment, how he kept showing up day after day to help at the shelter, how he saw her for who she really was. Sometimes, Grace said quietly, caring about someone isn't enough. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Meanwhile, in her expensive apartment, Regina Cross made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Dr. Morrison, This is Regina Cross. We need to talk about Grace Porter. The pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would force everyone to choose sides and would test Jonathan and Grace's growing feelings in ways they never expected. Dr. James Morrison sat across from Regina Cross in an expensive Manhattan restaurant, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting success and respectability. No one would guess this was the man who had destroyed Grace Porter's career. So, Dr. Morrison said, sipping his wine, Grace Porter has resurfaced. I always wondered what happened to her. My brother wants to put her in charge of a new free clinic, Regina explained. We need to stop it. Morrison's eyes darkened. That would be unfortunate. A woman with her history having access to medications again? Very risky. Then you'll help? For the right price. Morrison smiled coldly. I have a reputation to protect. Across town, Jonathan was in his office, reviewing security footage from Grace's old hospital. His private investigator had finally obtained it after weeks of searching. Stop there, Jonathan told his tech team, pointing at the screen. The grainy video showed Dr. Morrison entering the pharmacy after hours, not Grace. Enhancement. Working on it, sir, his tech expert said. But the original files were damaged. It'll take time to clean them up. Jonathan's phone buzzed. Another text from Grace. She'd been avoiding him since their conversation about her past, only sending brief messages about the shelter's needs. At the shelter, Grace was trying to stay busy. A local news crew had shown up, wanting to do a story about the homeless woman who'd caught Jonathan Cross's attention. No comments, no interviews, Grace told the shelter staff firmly. These people deserve privacy. But Grace, one volunteer argued, think of the attention it could bring to the shelter's needs. At what cost? Grace shot back. Having our people treated like some feel-good story? No. The shelter's door opened and Jonathan walked in. He looked tired, his usual perfect appearance slightly rumpled. Grace, he said, we need to talk. I found something. Before Grace could respond, commotion erupted outside. Victoria Sterling was giving an interview right in front of the shelter. Of course we're concerned, Victoria was saying to the reporters. Mr. Cross is a brilliant businessman, but he's being manipulated. This woman, Grace Porter, has a history of drug-related charges. Grace felt her chest tighten. Everything she'd feared was happening. Don't listen to this, Jonathan said, trying to guide her away. But Grace stood, her ground, walking straight out to face Victoria. The cameras swung toward her. Ms. Sterling. Grace's voice was calm but firm. You're blocking access to a soup kitchen. There are hungry people waiting to get in. Victoria smiled sweetly for the cameras. Just trying to protect the community. After all, your history with controlled substances is a matter of public record, Grace cut in. Yes, I was falsely accused. Yes, the charges were dropped. But right now you're preventing children from getting their only hot meal of the day. Is that the image you want on the evening news? The reporters turned their cameras to the line of people waiting. Elderly men, mothers with children, all watching the scene unfold. Victoria's smile faltered. If you want to discuss my past, Grace continued, we can do that. But first, why don't you put on an apron and help serve some meals? See the people you're really hurting with these publicity stunts. A small boy tugged at Victoria's expensive skirt. Lady, I'm hungry. The cameras caught Victoria's look of discomfort and Grace's gentle smile as she knelt to the boy's level. Come on, sweetie, let's get you some food. As Grace led the boy inside, the reporter's attention turned fully to Victoria, their questions now far less friendly. Inside the shelter, Jonathan watched Grace serve food with her usual quiet dignity. That was impressive. I learned a long time ago, Grace said, filling another bowl, that the best way to fight cruelty is with kindness. Victoria wanted a scene. She got a lesson instead. Grace, about Dr. Morrison. Not now, Grace cut him off. These people need to eat. But later, after the lunch rush, Grace finally let Jonathan show her what he'd found. They sat in the shelter's small office, watching the enhanced security footage. It's not perfect, Jonathan explained, but it clearly shows Morrison entering the pharmacy, not you. Grace watched her past play out on the screen, her hands trembling slightly. It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. Jonathan took her hand. Grace, with this evidence... What, I can clear my name? Get my old job back? Grace pulled away. That's not who I am anymore, Jonathan. These people, this work, it's where I belong now. You belong wherever you choose to belong, Jonathan said firmly. But Morrison should pay for what he did. Grace was quiet for a moment. Did you know that after I left the hospital, 3 more nurses were accused of similar things? All resigned quietly. All cases involved Morrison. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He's still hurting people. Yes, but... Grace was interrupted by a commotion outside. They rushed out to find Regina Cross standing in the shelter's main room. But she wasn't alone. Dr. Morrison was with her. "Hello, Grace," Morrison said smoothly. "It's been a long time." Grace froze. Jonathan stepped in front of her protectively. "Get out," he growled at Morrison. Now, Morrison smiled. "Is that any way to treat a concerned citizen? I'm just here to make sure my old colleague isn't putting anyone at risk." "The only risk here is you." Grace found her voice. "How many others, James? How many careers did you destroy to cover your tracks?" Morrison's smile vanished. "Careful, Grace. Slander is a serious charge. So is tampering with evidence, Jonathan. Cut in. Which we can prove you did." Regina looked between Morrison and Grace, doubt creeping into her expression. "What is he talking about?" "Your new friend is confused," Morrison said quickly. "Grace here has always been troubled." "Play the tape," Grace said suddenly. "Right now, in front of everyone." Jonathan pulled out his tablet, and soon the security footage was playing on the shelter's old TV. The room fell silent as they watched Morrison clearly entering the pharmacy, loading boxes into a cart. That could be anyone," Morrison sputtered. "The enhanced version shows your face quite clearly," Jonathan said coldly. "Would you like to see it again?" Morrison's composure cracked. He turned to run but found his path blocked by 2 police officers. Jonathan's security team had called them as soon as Morrison arrived. "Dr. James Morrison," one officer said, "we'd like to ask you some questions about several open investigations." As Morrison was led away, Regina turned to Grace. "I'm sorry, I was trying to protect my brother." "You're not the first person he fooled," Grace said quietly. That evening, after the excitement died down, Jonathan and Grace sat on the shelter's steps, watching the sunset. "The board called," Jonathan said. "Morrison's arrest is already making waves. 3 more former nurses have come forward. It won't bring back the years I lost," Grace said softly. "No." Jonathan took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "But it might help you build something new. The clinic still needs a director." Grace looked at him. "After all this, you still want me to run it?" "Now, more than ever." Jonathan squeezed her hand. "You fought for the truth when everyone doubted you. You kept helping others even when you were hurting. That's exactly who I want in charge." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "The clinic will need policies to prevent what Morrison did. Strong oversight, regular audits," and Jonathan smiled. "Is that a yes?" "That's a, I'll think about it." But Grace was smiling too. "One condition, though. The shelter gets priority access for emergency cases." "Deal." As they sat together watching the city lights come on, neither noticed Victoria Sterling watching from her car across the street, her face dark with anger. "This isn't over," she muttered, picking up her phone. "Time for Plan B." The truth about Morrison might have come out, but the real storm was just beginning. Victoria Sterling paced in her penthouse office, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. The morning news was playing on mute, showing footage of Dr. Morrison's arrest. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's done," the message read. "The papers are where you asked." Victoria smiled. "Perfect." At the construction site of the new clinic, Grace was reviewing the progress with the project manager. The walls were up, medical equipment was being installed, and hope was in the air. "We'll need extra heating in the waiting area," Grace pointed out. "Many of our patients won't have warm clothes." Jonathan watched her from across the room, admiring how naturally she'd taken charge. The past week since Morrison's arrest had brought them closer, though Grace still kept careful boundaries. "Miss Porter?" A delivery man entered, holding a large envelope. "This came for you." Grace opened it and froze. Inside were photographs, old ones from her mother's final days in the hospital. Private moments she thought no one had captured. "Grace?" Jonathan noticed her distress. "What's wrong?" But before she could answer, her phone rang. The shelter needed her. A family had just arrived, the children sick with fever. "We'll talk later," she told Jonathan, quickly tucking the envelope into her bag. "This can't wait." At the shelter, Grace found a young mother with 3 children, all showing signs of flu. As she checked their temperatures, her mind kept going back to the photos. Who had taken them? And why now? Jonathan, worried about Grace's reaction to the envelope, had his security team check the delivery service. The trail led nowhere. A cash payment, no sender information. His phone rang. It was Regina. "Jonathan, you need to see this," his sister said. "Someone sent documents to the board. Medical records showing Grace was prescribed heavy painkillers during the time she worked at the hospital." "What? That's impossible." "There's more. Bank statements showing large cash deposits. They're trying to prove Morrison was telling the truth about her." Jonathan's hands tightened on his phone. "It's all fake. Victoria's behind this." "Probably, but it looks real. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss the clinic project." At the shelter, Grace was finishing up with the sick family when she got another envelope. This one contained a note. "Leave now, or everyone learns the truth about your mother's death." Grace felt her world spin. No one knew about that night. The morphine pump, her mother's begging, the choice she'd had to make. "Grace?" Mrs. Martinez touched her arm. "You look pale, mija." "I'm fine," Grace managed a smile. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine. The carefully built walls around her past were crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. Jonathan found her there hours later, still tending to the sick children. "We need to talk," he said gently. "Someone's trying to hurt you." Grace looked up, her eyes tired. "I know." In the shelter's small office, Grace finally showed him the photos and the "Don't. They're threatening to expose something about your mother," Jonathan asked carefully. Grace's hands shook. "The night my mom died, she was in so much pain. The cancer was everywhere. She begged me." She stopped, unable to continue. Jonathan took her hand. "Grace, whatever happened, we'll face it together. You don't understand. If this gets out, the clinic—" "I don't care about the clinic, but I do." Grace pulled away. "Those people out. They need it. I won't let my past destroy their chance for help." Jonathan's phone buzzed, another message from Regina. The board had moved their meeting up. They were gathering tonight. "Come with me," he told Grace. "Tell them your story yourself, the whole story." "And risk everything?" "There are things I've never told anyone, Jonathan." "Trust me," he said softly. "Please." Before Grace could answer, Victoria Sterling walked into the shelter. She looked around with obvious disgust. "How quaint," she said. "The perfect place for secret meetings." "Get out," Jonathan growled. "Oh, I'm going," Victoria smiled. "I just wanted to deliver this personally." She handed Grace another envelope. "The board's going to love reading about your mother's mysterious death." Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were hospital records, morphine logs, and a half-written confession she'd started years ago but never finished. "How? Did you get these? Money opens many doors." Victoria turned to Jonathan. "Still think she's so perfect? Wait until you learn what your angel of mercy did to her own mother." "Shut up." Jonathan stepped toward Victoria, but Grace's voice stopped him. "No," Grace said quietly. "She's right. You should know the truth." She took a deep breath. "My mother was dying. The pain was unbearable. One night she begged me to help her end it, said she couldn't take another day of suffering." Victoria's triumphant smile faded as Grace continued. "I sat with her all night, listening to her beg. Then I called the doctors, asked them to increase her pain medication. By morning she was gone, peacefully, without pain." Grace's voice broke. "I didn't help her die. I helped her live her last hours without suffering." The shelter was silent. Even Victoria seemed taken aback by Grace's raw honesty. "That's your big scandal?" Jonathan asked Victoria. "That Grace showed mercy to her dying mother," the board, Victoria started. "The board will hear all of it," Jonathan cut her off. "Every detail. About Morrison's lies, about your schemes, about how Grace has spent years helping others while you've spent years destroying people." Victoria's composure cracked. "You're choosing her. This nothing, this nobody?" "She's not nobody," Jonathan said firmly. "She's everything I want to be." After Victoria stormed out, Grace and Jonathan sat in silence. "I'll resign," Grace said finally. "The clinic doesn't need this controversy." "No," Jonathan took her hands. "The clinic needs exactly this. Someone who understands suffering, who knows the difference between rules and compassion." Grace looked at him, seeing no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "Why are you fighting so hard for me?" Jonathan smiled softly. "Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Before Grace could respond, Regina burst in. "The board's waiting. Victoria's already there, telling her version of events." Grace stood up, straightening her shoulders. "Then let's go tell them the truth, all of it." As they left the shelter, Jonathan kept hold of Grace's hand. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But Victoria wasn't done playing games. In her car, she made one final call. "Plan C," she said into her phone. And this time, no mercy. The truth about Grace's past was out, but the real test of her relationship with Jonathan was just beginning. The Cross Industries boardroom was packed. Board members whispered among themselves as Victoria Sterling stood at the front, presenting her evidence against Grace. "Can we trust someone with this kind of past to run a medical facility?" Victoria was saying, her voice dripping with fake concern. "The liability alone." The doors opened. Jonathan walked in with Grace beside him, Regina following close behind. Grace had changed into clothes Barbara had brought from the office, a simple blue dress that made her look both professional and determined. "Sorry to interrupt," Jonathan said, not sounding sorry at all. "But since you're discussing Grace Porter, maybe she should speak for herself." Victoria's smile faltered. "We've already heard enough." "No," Richard Hampton, the eldest board member, cut in. "Let her speak." Grace walked to the front of the room, her head held high. She looked at the faces around her, wealthy, powerful people who'd never known real struggle. "Everything Ms. Sterling told you about my mother is true," Grace began. The room went silent. "She was dying of cancer. She was in pain. And yes, I was there the night she died." Grace took a deep breath. "But that's not the whole story. Let me tell you about my mother. A woman who spent 30 years as a teacher in the poorest parts of this city, who used her own money to buy shoes for kids who couldn't afford them, who taught me that helping others isn't charity, it's responsibility." She turned to Victoria. "You dug through my past hoping to find darkness. Instead, you found the moment that made me who I am. Watching my mother suffer taught me that everyone deserves dignity, especially in their darkest hours." The board members shifted uncomfortably as Grace continued. "You want to know if you can trust me with medications? Ask the shelter residents I've helped navigate the healthcare system. Ask Mrs. Martinez, whose grandson would have died without proper medical guidance. Ask the dozens of people I've connected with free clinics and assistance programs." Jonathan stepped forward. "If anyone wants proof of Grace's character, come to the shelter. Watch her work. See what real compassion looks like." Victoria wasn't giving up. "This is a business decision, not a charity." "No," Regina surprised everyone by speaking up. "This is about doing what's right. I was wrong about Grace, we all were." Richard Hampton cleared his throat. "Ms. Porter, what exactly happened with Dr. Morrison? I caught him stealing medications. He framed me to cover his crimes. Now he's in jail, and more victims are coming forward every day." Grace's voice was steady. "I could have fought harder then, but I was too worried about my mother's medical bills. I won't make that mistake again. If you want someone who'll look the other way, I'm not your person." The boardroom was quiet for a long moment. Then Hampton spoke again. "I've been on this board for 30 years. In that time, I've never seen Jonathan Cross fight so hard for anything, or anyone. He looked at Grace. The clinic project will continue with you as director. All in favor? Hands went up around the room. Victoria's face turned red with fury. You can't be serious. She's nothing but a... Careful, Jonathan's voice was cold. Choose your next words very carefully. Victoria grabbed her papers and stormed out, but not before turning to Grace. This isn't over. After the board dispersed, Grace sat alone in the conference room, emotionally drained. Jonathan brought her a cup of tea. You were amazing, he said softly. I was terrified. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I've never told anyone all of that before. I meant what I said before, Jonathan sat beside her. About loving you. Grace looked at him. Why? You could have anyone. I don't want anyone. I want you. Jonathan took her hand. You make me want to be better. To do better. Before Grace could respond, Regina rushed in. We have a problem. Victoria's gone to the press. She's holding a press conference right now. On the office TV, Victoria stood before a crowd of reporters. The public deserves to know the truth about Cross Industries' new clinic director. A woman with a suspicious past, whose own mother died under mysterious circumstances. Grace watched, feeling strangely calm. She really doesn't give up, does she? I'll handle the press, Regina said. We can spin this. No. Grace stood up. No more hiding, no more spin. She turned to Jonathan. Take me to that press conference. Well, Grace, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She squeezed his hand. Trust me. 20 minutes later, their car pulled up to the hotel where Victoria was speaking. Grace walked straight to the podium, Jonathan and Regina flanking her protectively. Victoria's eyes widened. What are you doing here? My job, Grace said into the microphones. Yes, my mother died while I was her nurse. Yes, I was accused of crimes I didn't commit. Yes, I've been homeless. I'm not hiding any of it. She looked straight into the cameras. But here's what else is true. I'm a licensed nurse who spent the last year helping homeless people get medical care. I caught a doctor stealing drugs and stood up to him, even when it cost me everything. And now I'm going to run a free clinic that will help thousands of people who can't afford healthcare. The reporters started shouting questions. Grace held up her hand. One more thing, she said. To anyone watching who's lost everything, who thinks they'll never get back up, don't give up. Your past doesn't define you. Your struggles don't define you. What defines you is how you help others, even when you're hurting yourself. Victoria tried to speak, but the reporters ignored her, focusing their questions on Grace. Jonathan watched proudly as Grace answered each one with honesty and dignity. Back at the shelter that evening, Mrs. Martinez hugged Grace tightly. We saw you on TV, Mihija. You showed them your heart. Did I do the right thing? Grace asked Jonathan later, as they sat on their usual steps. You did the brave thing, he replied. The Grace thing. Grace laughed softly. Is that a compliment? The highest one I know. Jonathan touched her cheek. Grace Porter, you are the most remarkable person I've ever met. This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, Grace didn't pull away. Under the same streetlight where they'd first met, they shared their first kiss, soft, sweet, and full of promise. But across town, Victoria Sterling wasn't finished. In her office, she met with a man in an expensive suit. Find them, she ordered, sliding over a stack of files. Every patient Grace Porter ever treated, every mistake she ever made. Someone out there has a story to tell, and I'm going to find. The man nodded. And if we can't find anything? Victoria's smile was cruel. Then we'll create something. Everyone has a price. We just need to find the right desperate person to tell the right desperate story. As Grace and Jonathan found their way to each other, dark forces were gathering. The real test of their love was about to begin. The new clinic was just 2 weeks from opening. Grace stood in what would be her office, arranging donated medical supplies when Regina rushed in. Have you seen this? Regina held up her tablet showing a local news website. The headline made Grace's heart stop. Former patient accuses clinic director of negligence. What? Grace grabbed the tablet, reading quickly. A woman named Sarah Jenkins claimed Grace had mistakenly given her the wrong medication 5 years ago, causing severe complications. It's not true, Grace said firmly. I've never heard of this woman. Victoria found her, Regina explained. She's scheduled to do a full interview tomorrow morning. Jonathan arrived minutes later, already working on his phone. My lawyers are looking into it. This Jenkins woman has a history of filing false claims for settlements, but the damage will be done. Grace sat heavily in her chair. Once people hear her story, we'll fight it, Jonathan insisted. We have your records, your perfect work history. It doesn't matter. Grace looked around her almost finished office. Victoria knows what she's doing. Plant enough doubt and people won't trust me with their healthcare. At that moment, Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway with her grandson Miguel. The boy was carrying a handmade card for Grace. We heard about the bad lady on TV, Miguel said, handing Grace the card. But we know you're good. You made me better when I was sick. Grace felt tears in her eyes as she read the card, signed by dozens of shelter residents. Each one had written a message about how she'd helped them. See, Jonathan said softly, these are the people who matter. They know the truth. But Victoria's plan was already working. By evening, 3 more former patients had come forward with complaints. All their stories had just enough truth mixed with lies to sound believable. They're all lying, Grace told Jonathan as they watched the news coverage. But how do I prove it? Jonathan held her close. We'll find a way, I promise. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her office meeting with Sarah Jenkins, a thin, nervous woman who kept fidgeting with her purse. Remember your story, Victoria instructed, sliding an envelope full of cash across her desk. Stick to the script, and there's more. Where that came from, what if? Someone investigates, Sarah asked. I never even met this Grace Porter. Don't worry about that, just do the interview tomorrow and disappear. We'll handle the rest. But Victoria wasn't the only one making plans. Regina had been doing her own investigation, troubled by how easily these accusations had appeared. Jonathan, she called her brother late that night. I found something. All these women making claims? They've all received large deposits in their bank accounts this week. Can you prove it came from Victoria? Not directly, she's too smart for that. But Regina stopped as another call came in. It was from Sarah Jenkins. Ms. Cross. Sarah's voice. Shook, I need to tell you something. About Victoria Sterling. The next morning, an hour before Sarah Jenkins was supposed to give her interview, Grace walked into the TV station. To everyone's surprise, she asked to speak first. Ms. Porter, the interviewer said, you understand these allegations are very serious. Yes, Grace replied calmly. That's why I'm here, to tell the truth. The cameras rolled as Grace spoke directly to the viewers. My name is Grace Porter. I've been a nurse for 10 years. I've been homeless. I've made mistakes. But hurting patients was never one of them. She turned to face Sarah Jenkins, who had just arrived and looked shocked to see Grace there. Ms. Jenkins, Grace said gently, we both know we've never met. Just like we both know why you're really here. Sarah burst into tears. I'm sorry, she paid me to lie, said it would just be a simple story, that nobody would get hurt. The interviewer leaned forward. Who paid you? Before Sarah could answer, Victoria Sterling burst into the studio. Stop the cameras, this interview is cancelled. Keep rolling, the interviewer ordered her crew. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked. You can't prove anything. These women needed money, I just helped them. To lie? Jonathan stepped out from behind the cameras. To destroy an innocent person's reputation? That's called fraud, Victoria. And conspiracy. You're done, Regina added, walking in with 2 police officers. We have the bank records, the recorded conversations, everything. Victoria looked around wildly, seeing her plan crumbling. You don't understand, she said to Jonathan. I did it for you. She'll ruin everything you've built. No, Jonathan took Grace's hand. She's helping me build something better. After Victoria was led away, Sarah Jenkins turned to Grace. I'm so sorry, I was desperate and my kids needed... I know about desperate choices, Grace said softly. The clinic opens in 2 weeks. Come see me. We'll talk about getting your family proper health care. That evening at the shelter, Grace and Jonathan watched the sunset from their usual spot on the steps. The news coverage is already changing, Jonathan told her. Victoria's arrest is the bigger story now. The clinic's reputation is safe. It's not about the reputation, Grace said. It's about the people we can help. She paused. You know, when Victoria was attacking me, all I could think about was protecting the clinic. Not myself, the clinic. That's why I love you." Jonathan pulled her close. "You always think of others first." "Not always." Grace turned to face him. "Right now, I'm thinking about us." Jonathan smiled. "And what are you thinking?" "That maybe it's time to stop being afraid, to trust that something good can last." Grace touched his face. "I love you too, Jonathan Cross." Their kiss was interrupted by cheers. The shelter residents had been watching through the windows. "About time?" Mrs. Martinez called out, making everyone laugh. But across town in a jail cell, Victoria Sterling made one final call. "It's time," she said into the phone. "Tell him to release everything." Grace and Jonathan's happiness was about to be tested one last time. Victoria's final revenge would target not just Grace, but everyone she loved. And this time, she had nothing left to lose. The morning of the clinic's opening day started perfectly. News crews gathered outside the renovated building, capturing shots of the line of people waiting for medical care. Grace, dressed in her new white doctor's coat, was checking last-minute details when Jonathan pulled her aside. Before the doors. "Open," he said. "I have something to show you." He led her to the clinic's entrance where a newly installed plaque read, "The Sarah Porter Memorial Clinic, dedicated to those who never stop helping others." Grace touched her mother's name, tears in her eyes. "Jonathan, she'd be proud of you," he said softly, "just like I am." The moment was interrupted by Regina, rushing in, her face pale. "Turn on the TV, now." On every news channel, the story was breaking. Cross Industries CEO accused of embezzlement, millions missing from charity funds. What? Jonathan stared at the screen as documents flashed across it. Bank statements, transfers, all seeming to show money from Cross Industries' charitable foundation being funneled into private accounts. "Victoria," Grace whispered. "This is her final." "Oof." Jonathan's phone exploded with calls from board members and reporters. The documents appeared legitimate, transactions going back months, all technically approved under Jonathan's authority. "These are fake," Jonathan insisted. "I never authorized any of this." "We know," Regina said. "But Victoria had access to all the foundation's accounts when she was your fiancé. She's been planning this for months." Grace watched the crowd outside growing larger. Not just patients now, but reporters and photographers. "We can't let this stop the clinic's opening." "Grace," Jonathan looked worried. "My name is on everything here. If these allegations stick, the clinic could lose its funding, its licenses. Then we'll find another way." Grace squared her shoulders. "Those people out there need help. I won't turn them away." But things got worse. Victoria's plan wasn't just about money. More documents emerged. Emails supposedly showing Jonathan and Grace plotting to use the clinic for insurance fraud, discussing kickbacks from drug companies. All fake, Regina confirmed after examining them. But very convincing fakes. By noon, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. They wanted Jonathan to step down temporarily while the investigation proceeded. "You can't be serious," Grace confronted them. "After everything Victoria's done, you're still letting her win?" Richard Hampton looked uncomfortable. "Miss Porter, we have to protect the company. These allegations, if they're true, they're not true." Grace's voice rose. "You want proof? Look outside. Look at the hundreds of people waiting for medical care. That's what Jonathan does with his money. He helps people." But the damage was spreading. The health department arrived, concerned about the clinic's licensing given the fraud allegations. They wanted to suspend operations pending a full investigation. In the midst of the chaos, Mrs. Martinez arrived with several shelter residents. "We heard on the news," she said. "We came to help." One by one, shelter residents stepped forward, telling reporters their stories, how Grace had helped them, how Jonathan had changed their lives. "That man?" Mrs. Martinez pointed at Jonathan on TV. "He served soup with us. He listened to our stories. He's no thief." Grace found Jonathan in his office, looking defeated as he watched the coverage. "So the board's right, I should step down. I can't let this hurt the clinic." "No." Grace took his hands. "Victoria wants you to give up. She wants to destroy everything we've built. We can't let her win." But how do we fight this? Grace thought. For a moment. We tell the truth, all of it. Not just our side, everyone's side. She grabbed her phone, calling every shelter resident she knew. Within hours, hundreds of people arrived at Cross Industries. Homeless individuals, former patients, shelter volunteers, all demanding to be heard. You want to know what Jonathan Cross does with his money? Grace addressed the reporters. Ask them. Ask the mother whose child got life-saving medicine. Ask the veteran who got his first real medical care in years. Ask anyone here. The stories poured out, not just about the clinic, but about quiet moments no one had seen. Jonathan paying for prescriptions anonymously. Grace spending nights with sick children. Small acts of kindness that had changed lives. Then Sarah Jenkins stepped forward. The same woman Victoria had paid to lie. I need to show you something, she told the reporters, pulling out her phone. She played a recording of Victoria explaining her plan months ago. She wanted to destroy them, Sarah explained. Said she'd plant fake documents, create a scandal. So big the clinic would never recover. Regina immediately called. They're lawyers. The recording was evidence of conspiracy, enough to get a warrant for Victoria's records. In her jail cell, Victoria watched her plan unravel on TV. Her phone calls were being traced, her co-conspirators turning on her one by one. But she had one last card to play. She'd arranged for one final document dump, personal information about Grace's past that would hurt not just her, but everyone who trusted her. Back at the clinic, Grace and Jonathan worked tirelessly, refusing to turn anyone away despite the chaos around them. As night fell, Grace finally took a break, stepping outside for air. Her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. Last chance. Walk away from him, or everyone learns what really happened that night. Grace stared at the message, her heart pounding. There was one secret she hadn't told anyone, not even Jonathan. Something that had happened the night her mother died. Something that could change everything. Jonathan found her there, still staring at her phone. Grace, what's wrong? She looked at the man she loved, knowing Victoria's final attack could destroy not just their relationship, but everything they'd built together. Jonathan, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. About the night my mother died, the whole truth. Inside the clinic, the phones kept ringing as Victoria's final plan began to unfold. The storm they'd thought was over was actually just beginning. And this time, the truth might not be enough to save them.